Hello and welcome to this presentation of the Learning Conversation in Metacognitive Pedagogy. I'm Phil Hulbig from the Program for the Advancement of Learning at Curry College. I'm going to start with a story of how I was duped by the No Child Left Behind Act. I thought this would be a good hook to grab attention at the start of this and tell a story that contrasts the pedagogy that was birthed through this legislation with the metacognitive pedagogy, and how primary metacognitive pedagogy is to the success of other pedagogies that we would enact inside the classroom, even poorly designed ones. Now, I'm not saying that No Child Left Behind was totally poorly designed, but I do think that the NEEP results sort of tell the whole story, and that this legislation really did nothing to improve education. And anecdotally, I feel it was detrimental to many of the most fragile students. But I will admit that the title No Child Left Behind fooled me, because at the time I was running and working a program for at-risk students in the public school. And it was really my students who were always being left behind. And I really wanted to believe that I lived in a world that could do that. But I'm not just a sucker for a slick title. The No Child Left Behind Act said that the bill would allow the science to drive educational improvement. At the time, I was following neurology and psychology literature on emotion, trauma, and learning because of the nature of my job, what has since become trauma-informed instruction. However, my pupil personnel director at the time explained to me that that would not be the direction that No Child Left Behind would be moving at us. We would not be doing trauma-informed instruction. What they really meant was that we were going to be using scientific practices within the classroom. Well, when I heard that, I really became sold. Because I had been experimenting using the scientific method with my students to investigate themselves metacognitively. And I was having some pretty surprising results, so I was overjoyed with the idea that we were going to be encouraging people to use scientific-based practices in the classroom. But again, it turned out I was wrong. That was not the kind of scientific practices they were really talking about. The science part was the test. And suddenly, we were testing everybody all the time, both teachers and students, required slews of tests. For example, since I was a public school teacher in a public school-based program, I needed certification in all of the areas in which I taught. Not just special education, but math, English, social studies, science. I even taught, gym and art, but luckily I didn't have to get certified in those. But what was worse was that we went from following the science to using scientific methods in the classroom, to going right back to relying on the same old psychological and academic testing regimens that we had always been using. Only now we interspersed it with a new MCAST test and district-wide initiatives that would, bring us branded scientifically based learning programs like Wilson Reading or Three Keys or even Everyday Math. Now, let me be clear, I am totally fine with these programs. Each of these programs present ideas and teaching techniques that I completely and strongly agree with. Heck, I am dyslexic. I may not even be where I am today without it have been all of those years of doing Orton-Gillingham phonics practice. The problem, though, with this global institution of these programs, to a point where there is literally no room for experimentation, is that there are students that just don't fit within these given systems, which happens with at-risk and neurologically divergent students like the ones I was teaching. In fact, it's a little-known fact that phonics-based reading programs like Wilson, like Orton-Gillingham, have special stipulations against using their program with students who have emotional problems, which at the time was basically my whole entire classroom. However, I was finding that what really worked with my students was an approach that I learned at Curry College at the PAL program, and it was called metacognition. As No Child Left Behind became instituted academic time started to be measured in tests, pre-tests, post-tests, academic tests, neurological tests, pre-made, branded programs, and rigid, all in the interest of being scientific. But my students were meeting success in these programs not because of the tests, but because of the metacognitive teaching that I was putting in beforehand to help them. I would explain to my students how their learning worked, why their brain and emotions worked the way that they did, and most importantly, how they could use this knowledge to allow their strengths to overshadow their weaknesses, or at least develop ways to work around them. And this one little routine that could be done through a conversation that went kind of like this, well, what is your problem? What do you think you need help with? Okay, let's try that and come back and talk about what happened. It was the scientific method applied through conversation, done to subjectively investigate your metacognitive action. The biggest value of this conversational approach was actually that we slowly moved these students out of my sub-separate program and back into the mainstream, which was always the end goal for these students in the program. They would graduate from my program back into actually what was called normal special education, which I always thought was kind of an insulting way of describing it. But that same metacognitive teaching routine that helped these students meet with success in this program now allowed them to survive in an environment outside of the safe little special education classroom we had created. And it could be maintained and supported through a simple conversation with the student. Moreover, the knowledge was transferable. I could get students to do it with each other, helping teach other students about their learning by talking about what they had learned about their own learning and what they were doing to be successful, to regulate themselves. As the testing and paperwork demands of the No Child Left Behind Act really started to impact my job, I had students help take up the slack. And by this time, some of my older students were meeting with tremendous success. I had students not only leaving the program, but some of them went on to become honor students, or captain of the wrestling team, or even valedictorian. But the biggest impact was on the classroom culture itself. And that was when I really started to contemplate the vast importance of metacognition and its unique pedagogy. It wasn't until years later, as I was getting my doctorate in metacognition, that I learned what I had developed in my classroom. In my sub-separate special education classroom, I had created a cultural proficiency in metacognition, and it was achieved through the use of the learning conversation. A metacognitive pedagogical intervention that is easy to learn, easy to describe, but takes a lifetime to perfect. The definition of the learning conversation is simple, and much of its practice, I would suggest to you, is uniquely intuitive. A learning conversation is simply a conversation about an individual's learning that sincerely and scientifically approaches that individual's developmental task of self-authorship. Now, I conceptualize the learning conversation as sort of embedded within a larger theory of metacognitive instruction. It is one approach to this style of instruction. The interesting part of metacognitive pedagogy is that I believe it flows from a very central, natural, informational processing approach. It flows from the practice of monitoring and control. So, from a basic practice of monitoring and control, we develop more advanced skills of self-regulation, such as goal setting, self-organization. And then we keep working towards an ultimate educational goal of self-authorship, as conceptualized by Robert Kegan, who described the development of self-authorship as one of the highest achievements humans can attain in their developmental lives. And one can see the progression from out of monitoring, comes self-regulation, which in turn develops into self-authorship. Notice the key procedures: making choices and reflecting, developing greater awareness and self-control, identifying and addressing environmental impacts on thinking and behavior. These are the key procedures. Now, I believe this is an evolution of a very old educational practice that dates back at least to the ancient Egyptians and Greeks. But it is different than the Socratic approach, at least in relation to how it was presented in Plato. Because there's no gotcha, there is no belittling of a person's thinking. You are examining it, connecting and supporting it. Not just pointing out where the student is wrong, but helping them make sense of what is happening, helping them self-assess and plan a response. So what am I going to be telling you today? Well, I'm going to be describing a metacognitive pedagogy that supports other pedagogies. It will be a pedagogy that will make what you do in the classroom more productive and effective. What I'm going to present you with today is a stripped-down approach to metacognitive education. It is intuitive and it can bring clarity to even the most ambiguous teaching situations. It is scientifically based in a way that is much different and more powerful, I believe, than other approaches. It is an approach that will be effective regardless of the student's intelligence, disability, creed, race, or trauma. And it is something that you will be able to walk out of here and start doing with your students immediately. Although I may suggest to you that it is more likely that you'll merely be building on something that you've already been doing with your students already, as I believe classroom-based pedagogy is the beneficiary of a student who is well educated in a metacognitive pedagogy. A good classroom teacher will see this, and for some metacognitive thinking and approaches, they're easy and intuitive. They are just their go-to. Easy to learn, hard to master. Some see education as a pendulum that swings back and forth between extremes. But frankly, I think that we may be in for something very special in the field of human development and education. Scientists in a diversity of fields, like education, psychology, neurology, biology, physics, information processing, artificial intelligence, they are all producing, tantalizing new insights into learning and intelligence. For today, I am really only going to be focusing on pedagogy. However, I do want to give you a quick sense of the amazing interdisciplinary convergence that is happening in the field of metacognition. So I'm just going to tell you a quick story about artificial intelligence and tie it all back to this. You see, once upon a time, if you were going to try to program intelligence into a computer, you would write what is called a linear program. Programmers would literally have to plan for and program for every possible contingency they could imagine, and they would still fail to produce anything that would pass as intelligence. However, then they started to create these cyclical programs, what are called self-referencing programs. And now with far less actual code, we have devices like the Roomba and computer programs like Siri or Deep Blue that can beat people in historically human-dominated games like Jeopardy. The sad and confounding fact, however, is that these self-referencing programs never become metacognitive. No matter how many Google bytes of information we allow these computers to reference, there is presently no way to even start programming artificial intelligence capable of metacognition. The assumption was that it would emerge. However, what we are finding in the field of education is that this very same move, a cyclical move, an educational move towards self-reference, feeds the learning process. It bolsters metacognition in humans. This process of metacognitive reflection is both a distinguishing feature of successful educational routines, but also a distinguishing feature of successful students. But back to the pedagogy. Learning conversations are best structured for work with individuals, and maybe then perhaps small groups. Traditional classroom formats really are poorly suited just due to simple crowd management needs. In the basic structure, there's just not enough time to deeply investigate in a student's learning. Also, these discussions can bring up things that are hard and scary to talk about, both as the talker and the listener sometimes. That's why we want to focus on strengths over weaknesses, not shying away from discussing negatives that might impact our ability has strong educational impact. For professors, it requires a level of kindness and honesty and a skill with questioning and the ability to model your own process of problem solving. For students, it requires them to look critically at themselves in a deep and non-superficial way. Many people are not ready for this, and some lack the ability or basic skills to look at themselves, warts and all, and then productively evaluate what they are doing to determine, again, where are their strengths and weaknesses, what should they do moving forward. It is hard, and this is why kindness and support are critical. The outcomes of the learning conversation are as students realize their role, they will begin to use the conversation to organize themselves. These conversations help students conceptualize learning as a process that they have, some kind of control over. They often involve making that implicit curriculum, that curriculum that you need to know to actually participate within the curriculum. It makes that implicit curriculum explicit. It does that through questions. Lots of how questions. How are you going to do it? How did that work out? Ultimately, the students demonstrate how well they are integrating their lessons by how well they are handling the events in their lives. Over time, learning conversations become part of an internal dialogue that students have with themselves. So evaluation in any metacognitive learning really is constant. This is because one of the key skills you are working on is self-assessment. Professors are guiding their students through a process of evaluating their own self-evaluations. Progress is measured by comparing the steps we kind of planned to do to the steps we actually took and the general level of success that it showed towards the attention of that goal. Through conversation, you give students the feedback that they need to start to regulate themselves. Sometimes this means attacking how they're trying to solve a particular problem. Other times, it may mean addressing their motivation or even, what they are spending a lot of their time on. What you are doing in a learning conversation, in a very real sense, is helping your students first identify important features of problems, processes, or the student's own way of knowing, and then helping them make sense of them. Organize what they know and have them identify them through some sort of interactive investigational process. You are really driving them into an interaction between an outwardly directed mental state and an inwardly directed mental state. Different kinds of order can be brought to this process through the use of discussion. But you can also bring in notes, charts, diagrams. I like to use planners, calendars, and lists, organizers. All of these things can be used to define or relate to a task or subject at hand. And they can bolster the limits of your learning conversation and really your learning in general. One of the final structural components I would like you to think about is the scientific method. An elegant, universal design for education, I believe, emerges when you bring a scientific methodology into your metacognitive practice. I believe metacognitive self-regulation can be supercharged through the supportive use of a scientific method. We tend to only see the scientific method in relation to an investigation of outside physical environments. But individuals can be taught to take a scientific approach to their own feelings, behaviors, and experiences to help them think about these issues and solve some of these problems that may afflict them. I also wanted to say a few quick words about metacognition and behavior modification, because I believe this was another part of the reason why I was so successful in my program. Behavior modification was not something sprung on you, but a process that you learn to engage in through a conversation. Metacognitive support from a personal process of self-authorship. Because from self-consciousness comes a level of self-control. And from improved self-control comes improved self-consciousness. The impact of emotion on cognition is much more significant than anyone ever expected, both in its positive and its negative dimensions. This means emotional experiences of trauma can limit a student's ability to reason. But positive emotional experiences of hope and curiosity can expand it. A metacognitive learning conversation will help students to identify both of these powerful emotional relationships, using conversation to minimize the impact of negative emotions and traumatic experiences on their learning, and maximize the impact of positive emotions like hope and curiosity on their drive towards their goals. So I would like to end with this last idea. The human capacity for understanding can be identified, ordered, and directed back upon itself in a way that produces new knowledge and new behavioral control within that individual. You, as an educator, can help your students realize this capacity. And if we can develop a broader culture of metacognitive support, I believe it would pay dividends in its support for the learning that is occurring in the classroom environments.